Victor Wembanyama is going to be a San Antonio Spur. And even though that is far from the only storyline from the 2023 NBA draft, it is the one that we are going to begin with because it is unbelievable. It is incredible that there have been 2 times in the Spurs history over the last 25 years that they have intentionally tanked, that they have lost games during the season with the goal being to get the first overall pick. And the first time they ended up with Tim Duncan over 20 years ago, and the second time they end up with Victor Wembanyama. This is an unbelievable thing for the Spurs franchise. They finally decided 2 years ago to really aggressively tank their way towards the bottom in a significant way by getting rid of DeMar DeRozan, by getting rid of some of the other veterans on their roster, and they are now rewarded, as is the case with how the NBA works, with the best draft prospect potentially in the history of the league. And this is a really interesting fit. This has been a storyline in terms of Wembanyama ending up in San Antonio because they're still seen, despite a lack of success recently, as one of the better developmental teams in the league, still one of the smarter front offices in the league, as well as, of course, having one of the better coaching staffs in the entire league. And if you want to think about the best environment for Victor Wembanyama to end up in terms of his own development, arguably that is San Antonio. It might not be the most exciting, the most interesting out of all these other teams that could have possibly made a huge jump up to number one as we've seen in the past. But in terms of his development, it's going to be fantastic for him. Hopefully they have a little bit more of a modern mindset in terms of his development, three-point shooting and all that stuff than they've had in the past. But this already makes them one of the most interesting young teams in the entire league with some of the other young guys they have on the roster. And more importantly for them, all the future assets that they have as well in terms of future first-round picks, future second-round picks, cap space flexibility. The Spurs, just like when they got Duncan in the lottery all those years ago, are right back on their path towards potentially being a real top-tier team over the next couple of seasons. So we know what's going to happen at number one. But second and third overall are now incredibly interesting as well because there were a couple of fits here at 2 and 3 where it was going to be pretty clear which players were going to be going where. But Charlotte ending up with 2, which we're going to talk about, as well as Portland ending up with 3, really, really interesting. So for most of the season, Scoot Henderson has been seen as the second best prospect in the class behind Victor Wembanyama, and only later on in the year did Brandon Miller emerge as one of the better prospects in the draft and potentially even number 2 overall over Scoot Henderson. And initially my thought was that Miller would fit really, really well in Charlotte. They need a legitimate wing, a guy that can play on both ends of the floor, and they already have LaMelo as their lead guard. And if he develops into a top-tier offensive player that can also guard, best case, like absolute best case scenario for him would be like becoming someone like Jason Tatum. That would be incredible for Charlotte. And even though they don't have a ton of other young pieces on the roster, getting a player on that level to go with LaMelo and some of the other pieces that they have, future first round picks and things like that, is going to be really helpful for Charlotte. However, I would not put it past them at all to end up selecting Scoot Henderson number 2 overall and just creating this dynamic duo of a backcourt. LaMelo is a really good floor spacer. He needs to work on a lot of other parts of his game, but he can shoot the ball. And the fact that Scoot struggles as a shooter is going to mean that that's going to be critical for them if they really want to develop those 2 guys together. And I think the higher floor play would be to go with Brandon Miller and hope he develops, because the wing is just a higher value position at this point in the NBA. But again, I wouldn't be surprised at all if Scoot goes second overall. And what happens there is going to heavily impact what happens at number 3 overall with Portland. They're going to end up with either Scoot Henderson or Brandon Miller, and either of them are fantastic fits for them. Even though they already have Anthony Simons there, Scoot Henderson would be, the guard of the future. We get to learn alongside Damian Lillard, or probably more so what they're hoping for is to get Brandon Miller there and to play alongside Dame, Anthony Simons, bring back Jeremy Grant. They've got some bigs there as well. Of course, they've got Shaedon Sharpe from last year. That wing combination would be unbelievable for Portland. More interestingly, though, if they end up with Scoot Henderson or Brandon Miller, and they have Anthony Simons, and they have Shaedon Sharpe, and they've got all these young pieces, do they start to look at this as it's time to move on from Damian Lillard because we have such a foundation here of youth? Can we continue to add to this by trading away Dame and really restart our franchise? I think if they had gotten the first pick in the draft, they 100% would keep Dame. They've got Victor Wembanyama. Like, you've got a chance to compete for a title within the next couple of seasons. But unless Scoot Henderson and Brandon Miller develop into all NBA caliber players very, very quickly, their value to Portland is much more of a long-term thing than what Damian Lillard is going to be able to provide to them over the next couple of seasons. And I think that is an interesting wrinkle now added to Portland's offseason. There's already been rumors about possibly trading Dame, and of course he wants to be the loyal guy and he wants to stay. But what would it look like if they decided to pull the trigger on that? Or if they keep Dame, maybe you trade Anthony Simons, maybe you trade a couple of other pieces on this roster. Then you've got Dame, Shaedon Sharpe, Brandon Miller, Jamie Grant, and you can kind of do both. You can kind of do what the Warriors have tried to do over the last few seasons with young guys and veterans and really try and compete at a high level. Regardless, the lottery worked really well out for Portland to jump up, to add more talent to a roster that desperately needs it. And now they've got some decisions to make, which brings us to 4th overall. The Houston Rockets were tied for the best odds to get the first pick in this draft, and they slid down all the way to number 4. They didn't slide down as far as they could have. That's going to be Detroit, who we're going to talk about here next. But it's pretty brutal for Houston, and this is the reality of tanking in the NBA. Is it's really exciting when you're San Antonio and you get the first pick, or you're Charlotte and you're Portland and you move up a little bit. But your lottery luck is not always going to fall the way that you want it to, and you've given away a season for. The Thompson twins are fine. There's some interesting prospects outside the top 3, but the top 3 was the prize in this draft, and of course, first overall being the main prize. And for Houston to have an opportunity to get the first pick in the draft and slide all the way down to 4 is pretty brutal. Like, they're still going to add some young talent. They're still looking good moving forward with Jabari Smith and Jalen Green, depending on how you evaluate those two guys. But this shows you the other side of the coin. As excited as San Antonio is right now, they very easily could have been where Houston is right now, where you tank, you throw away a season, and you end up with just a second-tier prospect. You never know. These guys could be awesome. Whoever they pick it for could be unbelievable. The draft is unpredictable. But if you're trying to guarantee yourselves the best odds, Houston did that, and ultimately it didn't work out for them. And then moving on now to number 5 overall, Detroit. This is as bad as it gets in terms of tanking in the NBA, where you are the worst team in the league. You finish with the worst record. You have the best odds of the number 1 overall pick. And you have 3 different teams jump up and you finish as low as you possibly can at 5th overall. That is just an absolutely brutal piece of luck there for Detroit. Now, granted, they've won the lottery recently with Cade Cunningham. They've got plenty of young talent. They're going to continue to add to that, but it's one of those things that makes you wonder, and I think one of the conversations that's going to come up as a result of this lottery, because the stakes were so high, is have we gone too far with the tanking? With changing the odds to make tanking not as valuable? Because teams like San Antonio, Houston, Detroit, all of them needed someone like Victor Wembanyama, Scoot Henderson, and Brandon Miller just as much as any other team at the top of this lottery. But only a couple of those teams are going to end up with that guy, and Houston, Detroit on the outside looking in, thinking maybe the odds, wishing that the odds were as good as they used to be, and falling all the way down to 5 is just, it's really, really tough if you're a Pistons fan, because you had an opportunity for a generational guy, and just like Houston, you're going to end up with a second-tier prospect who may or may not be good, but your rebuild just took a significant hit. Despite young talent on the roster, you'd be feeling much better if you were in that top 3 if you were either of those teams. Now, given the way the lottery shook out, my prediction as of this moment, literally right after the lottery happened, would be Wembanyama, Brandon Miller, Scoot Henderson 1, 2, 3, the Thompson twins 4 and 5 in some order. And realistically, the Trailblazers are probably going to keep Dame unless he's like, hey, you guys are clearly doing a youth thing here, I'm out. And really the deciding factor of what happens throughout the rest of the top 5 is going to be determined by what Charlotte does it to. We're going to have a pretty clear picture going into draft night, what's going to happen for each of these teams. But regardless, this is an exciting night. It's unbelievable that San Antonio got the first pick. And again, shows you the other side of tanking, unfortunately, for teams like Detroit and Houston.